Hello everyone! In today's video we are continuing our Advanced Cross series, and this series will cover all of the concepts that you need to make your basic cross. The last video was getting the daisy and then getting the cross, and in this video we're just going to go straight to the cross. And there's quite a few concepts that we can cover on this. Now a quick disclaimer before we start, this is just stuff that works for me, and I'm going to try to do my best to explain it to you, but really the goal of this video is to teach concepts, because a lot of these things that I've found on my own, but I understood the concept from somebody else. So I watched a video or I saw it online, and conceptually I knew what and how it was supposed to work, but I didn't really get it until I started messing with it and practicing. So I encourage you to try to apply these concepts, and the only way that you're really going to get good at the cross is if you take these concepts and you actually apply them. So the goal of this video is to teach you those concepts. I'm going to be breaking up this video into 3 separate videos, actually. It's just more content than I originally thought it was going to be. So this video is going to cover all of the concepts that we're going to need to know in order to solve the cross effectively. So it'll teach you all the concepts you need. The next video will apply those concepts in solve. So it'll be quite a few walkthrough solves. It'll also build on our knowledge that we learned in this video. We're going to kind of increase some of the skill sets we have, but it will be more focused on doing it in actual solves. This video will be more of a conceptual video. And then the third video of this basic cross section is going to cover some more advanced topics, and we're going to do a real deep dive into every single pattern you can see, how to become color neutral, and some practice tips. And it's important to remember that we are building our knowledge with each video in the series, so this is just building upon all the daisy information that we learned in the last one. So if you don't understand the concepts from the previous video, please go watch those. They are going to be required in this video. Let's get started. So let's learn a little bit about the cross before we actually start learning some concepts. And this video might start a little slow, but I want to be as thorough as possible, because theoretically you've just learned how to do the daisy and then you're transitioning into the cross. So let's talk about the cross. So this is your solved cross. We all know what this is. And the scrambled version of a cube has 190,000 different combinations that the cross pieces, these 4 edge pieces, can be in. And we're basically going to break those down into 8 moves or less. And most of the time you can get it into 7 moves or less, but 8 moves is really the realistic goal when you're starting, so even 9 really. And a lot of times a few more moves might be a little faster, which we'll discuss a little later in the video as well. For these concepts, I'm assuming unlimited inspection time, so once you get a solved or a scrambled cube, I'm not limiting it to the 15 seconds, just take as long as you need to understand and learn how to apply these concepts. I suggest you get a test cube because it really focuses your eyes on the 4 pieces that you need to care about, and it's a very good learning tool. So go get a test cube. I talk about that in my previous video as well. And it's also very important to know your color scheme. We are going to be solving the cube offset from their actual locations, and it's important to know that orange is always on the left of green, and red, or orange is on the right of green, and then red is always on the left of green. And then your opposite of green is blue, and your opposite of orange is red. So you need to know your color scheme. And if you don't know your color scheme, go memorize it. It's just one of the things you have to memorize. You have to know your color scheme in order for you to have an efficient cross. Now the possible places that edge pieces can be in are, they can be in the bottom, in what I would consider a solved state, so it's pointing towards the bottom, and they don't necessarily have to be, in the right location, but as long as they're pointing to the bottom. You have a piece in this bottom layer that's facing out of the cube, so it's either facing out this way, or out this way, or out that way. So it's facing kind of along the circumference of the cube here, and this is what's called a bad edge. You have pieces that can be in this middle slice layer. So there's a piece in the middle slice layer, there's a piece in the middle slice layer. So you have these middle edges, and these are always considered good edges. You can always insert them in one move. And then you have the top layer. So the top layer, they can either be facing up, and they're good, or they can be facing kind of along the circumference again. And when they're facing out like this, they're considered bad edges. Now, what is a good edge and a bad edge? A good edge is any edge that you can insert in one move. So this would be a good edge because you can move it down in one move. Or if it's up here, you can insert it in one move, right? So that's what a good edge is. Now a bad edge is an edge where you need to take at least 2 moves to insert the move, or insert the piece. So you can't ever insert this piece without moving at least twice. You'd have to move it down into the middle layer and then down into the bottom. So basically when you're converting a bad edge into a good edge, all you're doing is you're moving it into the middle layer, and every single piece in the middle layer is a good edge. Because it might look like a bad edge here, but when you rotate it, you can just one move it down into a good edge. So all you're doing when you're moving bad edges into good edges is you're just moving it into the middle layer, and then you can insert it in one move. Now, how you recognize a bad edge or a good edge, the only two possible bad edges on the cube are if they're in this top or bottom layer, and if they're facing out. So if they're facing here or here, then they're bad edges. So you can quickly scan the cube and see how many bad edges there are. So there's only one. So I count all the ones sticking out on the top and the bottom. So if it was like this, those both would be bad edges. Those both are good edges. So you can scan the cube very quickly and see, okay, I have 1, 2, 3 bad edges on this one. And how we're going to determine what piece to start with is we're going to count some bad edges and kind of guess how difficult it's going to be. So a lot of people, they will try to solve either white or yellow, so they're white or yellow neutral. And once you get into being a little better at the cross, I suggest you at least start trying to solve yellow crosses as well, because it just gives you more options to get a better cross. And yellow is easy to flip to because it's just inverted. But anyway, so we can scan this cube, and all we're looking for is 2 whites here. So we know this one's not oriented, and that's the only one not oriented. So we know this whites have 1 unoriented piece. But if we flip over to the yellow, and then there's an unoriented, there's an unoriented, and so this one has 1, 2, 3 unoriented pieces. And you don't even have to flip it over, you can just rotate, and you're looking at the top and the bottom. And if the face is on the outside, you know it's a bad edge, and we need to convert those bad edges into good edges. But if you have 3 bad edges, you know you need to convert 3 bad edges, and that's more than just 1. So it's important to be able to identify if an edge is good or bad, and really the easiest way is if it's in the top or bottom layer and it's facing out. So that's facing out, that would be facing out that way, here is facing out this way, and then here's facing out towards you. So it's just not up or down, then they're bad edges. And then everything in the middle is a good edge. So the only 2 things you're looking for is, if they're in the top or bottom layer and they're facing kind of along the circumference, then they're bad edges. Okay, so let's cover some of the basics on solving the cross. First of all, we're always going to be solving the cross on bottom. A lot of people start solving the cross on top, and they transition to the bottom later in their careers, their cubing life. But I think that's kind of a wasted step. I think you should just start solving on the bottom, because you're going to learn your color scheme, especially if you just solve white. Then it's just a fast way to learn your color scheme. You don't have to mentally flip it, because if you solve it like this, then orange is to the left of green, and if you solve it like this, orange is to the right of the green. So it's better just to start solving on bottom. So from now on, you should start solving all of your cross pieces on the bottom. So you're going to point your yellow up, and then your white down, and that's how you're going to solve the cube. Right? Occasionally, it's okay to solve it on the front or the left, and then your last move. So if you're solving it, and your last move might be a M slice of some sort to put the white center on the bottom. So that's acceptable too. I don't ever really use that. I probably 95% of the time I just solve on white on bottom. It's just easier for me to do that. And we're also going to solve relative to the correct orientation of the pieces. So if we have a solved cube, we have a blue and there's a red to the right of blue. Well, if we solve it like this, this works too. We're just 1 move away from being solved, right? So we're going to solve it in their relative positions. And this is why you need to know your color scheme. And it's not even really that difficult, but you really have to know opposites. And we're going to go over how to recognize opposites and the adjacents to see if they're correctly oriented. But basically what you're going to do is you're going to solve the cube the fastest way, or solve the cross the fastest way you can. And what a lot of people do is they will see opposites. So they'll say, okay, here's a red and an orange as an opposite, so I know this is in the opposite position. So if I solve this and then rotate it around, it'll be in the right position. So conceptually, what we're doing is we're solving the opposite colors. So if we know this one's opposite, then we take the opposite of green and we put blue here. And we know this one's oriented relative to this piece. So we solve this one, and then we solve this one. Well, they're not solved, but they're solved relative to each other. And then when you do your adjustment of the lower face, it's going to solve those 2 pieces. Because we know they're in the correct orientation. It doesn't matter if they're offset by 1 or offset by 2. we know they're in the correct orientation. And the easiest way to recognize this is either you're solving on the same color or you're solving on opposite colors. So orange is opposite red, green is opposite blue, and it's easy to tell if these are opposites. Now you can also solve adjacent. And how you would solve adjacent is there's a couple techniques that I found that will easily let you look at this scenario and determine, is this correctly oriented or is this incorrectly oriented? Because you'll see quite a few instances where you might see that, and you don't, without knowing your color scheme, you might not know that red is on the right of blue. So what's an easy way to determine how to tell if these are oriented correctly? We'll go over that in here in a second. So how do we tell if the pieces in the bottom are oriented correctly or not? Because a lot of times you'll have a scenario where, let's say I'm solving for blue in this case. Well, here's a blue and here's an orange and white, but I don't know if this is oriented correctly. And just by some basic pattern recognition, you can tell if these two are oriented correctly or not. And I'm going to teach you that pattern recognition now. It doesn't necessarily help if you know your color scheme in and out, but if you notice that you don't, like if you notice it, you don't have to know your color scheme to know the orientation of pieces. And that's what we're going to cover right now. This is kind of a little more advanced concept, but I think it's important to include in the beginner's video because this is something that will help you recognize if two corner pieces are oriented correctly, and that's very important. So we're just going to analyze how to do that. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to scan the two centers of these two pieces here. So we're going to scan vertically down and look for a couple things. And then we're going to look at these two pieces and these two pieces. So we're going to look at diagonal pieces. And then we're going to run through a couple options. So the first thing we'll do is we'll scan. If they're the same, we know it's oriented. We're good. The second thing we're going to do is scan. And if we see 4 colors, it can either be oriented or not. There's only 2 cases of 4 different colors. And it's either opposites or adjacents. So this would be blue and orange, and there might be green and red. So there'll be adjacents instead of opposites. And if the opposites, we're good because we know when we move this over to its correct location, we're also moving this to its correct location. So we're looking for opposites, and we're good. But if it's offset by 1, how do we tell if this is oriented correctly? Well, the easy way to tell is we're going to scan the diagonal ones. So we're going to look for diagonal ones. We're going to look for a pair and opposite colors. So here's our blue pair, and then here's our orange, red, which red is opposite of orange. And the reason this works is when we move this blue over, we also have to move this red to the other side of orange, so it's got to be the opposite color of this face. So we'll move that over, and then we can see that's oriented correctly. So when we're looking, if you see a pair and opposites, then it is oriented correctly, and we're good. We'll continue. There's the solve state. Here's, again, this is a pair and opposites, so we know we're oriented correctly. And here's opposites, opposite, opposite. And again, a pair and opposites, so we're oriented correctly. Now, the adjacent version of that, so the incorrectly oriented, so what you're actually looking for to see if pieces are incorrectly oriented are, this one's easy to tell, because here's one's matched up and here's not. So that's I would think that would be an obvious, this one's not oriented correctly, right? Because this one has to go over here. But how do we tell if it's offset by 1? Well, we're going to look for, we see 4 colors, so we're going to scan the cube. These don't match. There's 4 colors now, but now instead of being opposites, they're adjacents. So if they're adjacents, they're not oriented correctly. If they're opposites, they are. If they're adjacents, they're not. So the orange is adjacent to green, and blue is adjacent to red. So these are adjacents, so it's not oriented correctly. Here's another one where you have a bar and opposites. So we know, this is kind of easy to tell that these is not oriented correctly. And then on this one is the opposite of the solve state. So basically we have 2 pairs, but we're going to look at them diagonally. So here's a pair and here's a pair, and they're both the same. So we just have a pair and a pair, and we know if we have a pair and a pair, well, this one will have to go over here, but then this one also has to come over here. So when we move this, we're pushing this away, and that can't ever be correct. So we know if we see 2 pairs diagonally, it's not oriented correctly. That one we can tell. That one are adjacent, and then that one we can tell, right? And again, for the correctly oriented pieces, they match. There's a pair and opposites, opposite, opposite, and then a pair and opposites. So that's how to tell easily if 2 pieces are oriented correctly. And this also works if it's on the top. So if you have this, well, here's a pair and here's opposites, so we know this piece is oriented correctly relative to this one. It also works here. If you can mentally do the work, you're looking at, basically what you're looking at is you're looking at the center and the other edge, and then this center and the other edge. So if you look at center and other edge, and then opposites, the same thing works here. You're looking at this center, or this center and the other face's edge, and this center and this face's edge. So we can tell this is the same and opposite, so it's still oriented correctly. And this even works if it is, let me get that out of the way, if it is flipped upside down. So it doesn't have to be a good edge, it could be a bad edge, and you can still tell this process still works, because we're going to look at these pieces. Just ignore the whites. So here's the same, and then there's opposite, so we know this piece is oriented correctly, meaning that it needs to go to the right of blue. So its location relative to blue is correct. And this also works on the top. So if you see this, here's blue, blue, and then opposites. So we know this red goes here, not here. So that might help you, opposites, or the same and opposites, that might help you easily glance at a cube and see if two pieces are correctly oriented relative to each other. So we're going to look at our example here. So we have a, let's say we're doing the blue face. So we have a blue, we have an orange and a white, and what's the pattern we see? We see the same, and then we see opposites, so we know this is oriented correctly. So when we test it, it lines up, it's oriented correctly. So the same concept applies. Here's the same, here's opposites, and then here's opposites, opposites. So we know that these two pieces are oriented correctly. So we can make other decisions based on that. So if we have these two oriented correctly, and then what's the opposite of white is yellow, so here's yellow, here's white. So we know that's opposite, and we know this one's in the right spot too. So we can move it down, right? So I hope that made sense. It's really just how to recognize when you're looking at two edges, and they could be they could be like that too. But how to look at two edges and determine if this is in the correct position relative to this one. And you can just the same opposites and you're good. So that's how to tell how two pieces are oriented relative to each other. When we're solving the cross, basically what we're doing is we're finding all four pieces, and then we're going to come up with an algorithm on the fly that will insert all those four pieces kind of the most efficiently that we can. And how you do that is you convert these bad edges. Remember we talked about the bad edges being in the top or the bottom layer, kind of facing out of the cube, right? And we're going to convert those by putting them in the middle layer, because that's all that means. If we take this edge and we put it in the middle layer, well, now it's a good edge. Now it's a bad edge. Because a bad edge is 2 moves to insert, a good edge is 1 move to insert, right? So all we're doing when we're converting a bad edge to a good edge is we're just putting it in the middle layer. And there's a couple different ways you can do that. The most common way is if you place it over a good edge. So this is a good edge, and if you place it kind of over it. So when you insert this good edge, you're also converting this bad edge into a good edge. And that's the main concept of the basic cross, is you're just taking bad edges and flipping them into good edges by, when I move this down, now it's in the middle layer, now we know it's a good edge. Whether it's like that, you can do an F move, it doesn't matter, it's just whatever it takes to convert this bad edge into a good edge, right? And there's a couple different patterns that you can look for, and we'll go over that here in a minute. But let's talk about some useful inserts. So one of the inserts that you can do is really when you finish your cross, you can solve some of your cross on the top, and then the last thing you can do is an M2, and it will place that on the bottom. So as long as these two pieces are solved relative to each other, so in this case we have an orange and we have a red, and then we have these positioned correctly when we do an M2. So we'll do an M2, and then now they're positioned, they're oriented relative to each other, and then we can solve, do the adjustment of the lower face, and then finish the solve. But it's entirely possible to solve a couple pieces down here and a couple pieces up here, and then one of the last moves you do, or even if it's like this, one of the last moves you do is an M move to put that in place and then do your ALF. That also works. So don't be shy of M moves. M moves are really good at inserting unoriented edges here. You can do an M move like that. You can also do fat moves, so we can, if we want to insert this one, we can do a kind of a fat L move or a R prime. I guess this would be L prime. Yeah, so a fat L prime move. Or you can do it with like, you're just thinking about it differently. It's the same moves, it's just you're doing it a little differently. So you can also insert this in the back with that same fat move concept, so we can take this whole side, move it up, push it in, and then move it down. So if this piece needed to go back here, then we can move this whole side up, push it in, and then move the whole side back down. So you can use fat moves, you can use M moves to solve things. And another thing to think about is if you want to convert this into a good edge, well, one way to do it is to do an F move, and that converts it into the middle layer. It's a good edge. But if you notice that you have a bad edge here and then a bad edge here, you can insert this edge and convert this one at the same time. You can do an M move, move this over, and then undo your M move, and that will insert a bad edge here, like we talked about a second ago, and then it also reoriented this bad edge into a good edge here, so now we're one away from solving it. So again, I want to get that out of the way. So again, if you see these two, and we can insert both of these by doing an M move, moving this over, and then when we move this down, now our blue is just one L2 away from that. So don't be afraid of M moves. I'm not going to go over a ton of M move inserts, but there are quite a few that you can use. You can also use slice moves, so if you need to move a piece from here somewhere else, you can do a single slice move. Don't shy away from slice moves, because they are helpful in some cases. A few other moves that are helpful whenever you're solving a cross is if you notice that you solved two of them correctly, but not these two, then you can just do an M2, U2, M2, and that will replace them. So if you notice that your middle ones were solved incorrectly, then you just, and these are correct, then just do an M2, U2, M2, and that will solve them correctly. So another helpful move is once you solve your cross, if you notice that two of them are correct, and then these two adjacents you just happen to mess up and they were flipped incorrectly, then if we get this out of the way, so basically what we're going to do is we're going to move the green over, but we're going to hide this piece first, so we're going to move this out of the way, so put it in the back, and we're going to move this over, put our red down to where it should be, undo your D move, and then, so it's a kind of a quick little 4 moves, 5 moves, something like that, and it'll flip those two. So if you notice that you can easily get there, then it's an easy way to flip two adjacent pieces, and it's relatively quick. So if you already have two solved relative to each other, and you can easily set this case up, well, then it's easy to solve this case because it's just a few moves, and then you can do your ALF to solve. So that's important to know too. So if you have two that are oriented incorrectly, then it's just a couple moves to orient them correctly, and it doesn't really affect anything else that's going on up here on the cube. Another common insertion technique is to use D2 moves on the cube, so you should get used to doing that with both hands. So we're just doing a pinky ring, sorry if you can't see that, pinky ring D2 move, and that's useful whenever you have a scenario where we know that these three are oriented correctly, because blue is to the left of orange, and we need to insert this. So we can do this two ways. We can either move the whole top and then move the green down, or we can D2 and then move the green down. So using D2s, you use D2s a lot in solving the cube, and because a lot of times you'll have 2 or 3 pieces on one face, and you just need to move it down, insert, move it down, insert, move it down, insert, move it down, insert. So there's a lot of D moves, and you want to do D moves instead of F moves and B moves, because B moves aren't very efficient unless your hand's regripped correctly. So if you can think of a way to have your hand in the right position, then yeah, sure, use some D moves, or use some back moves and front moves. But if you want to avoid regrips, and we want to avoid regrips as much as possible, so in this case, I know orange goes to the left of blue, and we can tell by using our, here's adjacents and here's adjacents, so we know that's not oriented correctly. So we know this needs to go on the other side of blue, so you could D2, if I had a good cube, and then move that down. And then this one goes next, so green goes next, so we'll move that down, and then red goes next, and then we'll adjust. So it's important to be comfortable using D moves to do inserts, because they're very helpful, and they don't move what's going on up here, so you can look ahead to your next pair, and that's eventually what we're going to do. We're going to solve the cross and also be looking ahead. So get comfortable with D moves as well. And one more thing we're going to look at is kind of small U moves. And these I use a lot, but it's a bad habit of mine. I'm trying to break it. And the only reason really that you would want to use one of these small U moves is if you see nothing here and you want to rotate the cube to see what's in the back. Because once you do that, then when you do a small U move or a small U2 move, it's going to rotate the top two layers and you'll get to see what was on the back of it. So if you are about to solve your cross, so if you're here and these are opposites, so we know that this is oriented correctly. So we can either AUF with a D2 or we can AUF with a U2. It depends on what's facing you. So if you don't see anything and you want to see what's on the back, then use a fat version. If you see something that you want to keep or prepare, or you know that these two are your pieces that you care about, then D2 it, and then you won't be moving anything on the top layer. So when you're doing your adjustment of the last face, or the lower face, make sure that you just do a quick glance to see if you see anything you like, and if you do a D2, and if you don't, do a U2, or a fat U2, and that will kind of help you look for your next set of pairs after the cross. Another common scenario to insert this case, so it's a bad edge, because it's top or bottom layer and it's facing out of the circumference of the cube, so it's a bad edges. And how to solve this edge in a kind of a relatively quick manner is we can just do an R, move it into the right location, do another R, and then move this back. So if you ever notice that you have this scenario, you can either go this way or you can go this way, and that'll solve that case without really messing up any of the other cross pieces. So if you notice that after you think about your cross and you're going to be stuck with one bad edge here, it's not that big of a deal. And credit Bad Mephisto for this. I think he was the one that originally discussed this. But you can flip this edge and put it in the same spot just by one of those relatively quickly. Okay, so while I was editing this video, I realized that I'm already half an hour in, and I don't want my videos to be that long, so I'm going to cut this video short. The next video is going to be the application of all these concepts while we're doing our solves. We're also going to be building on that knowledge, but we're going to start solving the cube and showing you how to apply these concepts that we've discussed in this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below, and until then, happy cubing!